Canada is the land of syrup, Tim Hortons, curling, and
a total absence of free speech?
Viva Frei, Montreal litigator turned YouTuber. I do these things called vlogs. Boom! This is Barney, the vlog dog. Say hi, Barney.
Oh, yeah.
I have been promising this vlog for a while. I read the decision about 2 weeks ago, but haven't gotten around to it because of internet drama. But we're doing it today. The decision in which Mike Ward, a stand-up comic, was ordered to pay $42,000 in damages by the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal as a result of certain jokes he made with respect to a kid. Let's do this. Okay, down you go. There's going to be a great amount of detail and procedure to explain in the context of this decision to make sense out of it, but for now we're just going to set out who the parties are for the general context. The victims were Jérémy Gabriel, who was about 14 years old at the time all of this took place, and his parents, Sylvie Gabriel and Steve Lavoie. And as relates to Jérémy, he was born prematurely in 1996 and suffers from something called Treacher-Collins syndrome. Treacher-Collins syndrome, for anyone who is unfamiliar with the condition, causes certain malformations of the head, the ears, and the palate. And according to the judgment in Jérémy's case, it also caused severe deafness. And in order to understand how Jérémy even became the object of Mike Ward's humor, we're going to read paragraph 12, which sets out a pretty good timeline of what happened. In 2005, Jérémy took part in the Donnez au Suivant television program and sang the national anthem at the Bell Centre prior to a Montreal Canadiens match. In March 2006, he attended a Celine Dion concert in Las Vegas, then met and sang with her in her dressing room. In May 2006, he went to Rome to sing for the Pope. After that, he appeared on various television programs and released an album. His autobiography was published in 2007. In 2008, he appeared in the documentary on Treacher-Collins syndrome. After that, he performed a few concerts and took part in fundraisers for various organizations. In 2012, he became an ambassador patient for the Shriners Hospital, for which he traveled in Canada and in the United States. Mike Ward, for his part, had been a stand-up comic since 1993. And from 2010 to 2013, Mike Ward apparently had a comedic bit which he called the Untouchable or the Sacred Cows, where he poked fun and made jokes at the expense of the Untouchables, people who you could not make humor about because it was too politically incorrect or sensitive a topic. And one of the objects of his humor was Jérémy. And I'm not going to repeat what Mike Ward said under the guise of humor, I'm just going to flash to some of the terms right now. But Mike Ward performed his bit and it was featured online for an extended period of time after the original performance. In 2010, Jérémy, 14 years old, in school, suffering from a very serious condition, is sent the video of Mike Ward's performance. According to Jérémy, other kids saw the video as well, started making fun of Jérémy, repeating some of the jokes, and it took a massive psychological and emotional toll on Jérémy. It took a toll on the family as well because some of Mike Ward's jokes were at the expense of Jérémy's mother, whom he alluded to exploiting her child so that she could buy a fancy sports car. In his defense, Mike Ward acknowledges that his humor is edgy and will be considered offensive to some. And according to the judgment, Mike Ward apparently acknowledged himself that his jokes with respect to Jérémy may have crossed the line. And so that's the overall context. On the one hand, you have freedom of expression and a stand-up comedian's right and freedom to make what some might consider to be offensive jokes. And on the other hand, you have an individual with the right to honor and dignity, and in this case, a 14-year-old kid suffering from Treacher-Collins syndrome, who may in fact suffer at the expense of the freedom of expression of the stand-up comic. How do you balance these two rights, and what conclusion did the tribunal ultimately come to? But before we get into the conclusion of the tribunal, we have to actually explain what the tribunal is, what the commission is, and what the applicable laws are. In Quebec, we have something called the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, and it is regarded as a quasi-constitutional law in that no other law within the province can derogate from the terms of the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. In the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, we have three sections in particular, sections 4, 10, and 49, which read as follows. Section 4, every person has a right to the safeguard of his dignity, honor, and reputation. Section 10, every person has a right to full and equal recognition and exercise of his human rights and freedoms without distinction, exclusion, or preference based on race, color, sex, pregnancy, sexual orientation, civil status, and except as provided by law, religion, political convictions, language, ethnic or national origin, social condition, a handicap, or the use of any means to palliate a handicap. Section 49. Any unlawful interference with any right or freedom recognized by this charter entitles the victim to obtain the cessation of such interference and compensation for the moral and material prejudice resulting therefrom. In case of unlawful and intentional interference, the tribunal may, in addition, condemn the person guilty of it to punitive damages. Alright, and a little bit of detail on the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal itself. It was created in virtue of the Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms in 1990. The tribunal consists of judges and experts who are appointed in virtue of the law, although only the judges have decision-making powers. And the tribunal itself is what is referred to as a specialized tribunal. It was created in virtue of a law, and its jurisdiction is derived from that law. And this particular matter was brought before the Commission on the basis of discrimination against Jeremy and his family resulting from his handicap. What happens is that the alleged victims file a complaint, the Commission will do an investigation, and if it determines that there is basis there for a claim before the tribunal, they will initiate that claim and pursue it until judgment. If they decide to pursue the claim for and on behalf of the alleged victims, they will assume the costs of so doing. If the Commission decides not to pursue the claim, the alleged victims can still pursue the claim themselves at their own expense. They can also seek recourse before the Superior Court. They don't necessarily need to proceed by way of the tribunal. The benefits are obviously that if the Commission decides to pursue the claim for and on behalf of the alleged victims, there is no cost to the alleged victims, and the tribunal tends to be a little victim-friendly as opposed to defendant-friendly. And in this particular case, the tribunal came to the conclusion that they did in fact have jurisdiction because the damages related from comments made by wards that related to a prohibited grounds of discrimination, handicap. The tribunal came to the conclusion that discrimination exists within the sense of the Charter when three elements are met: a distinction, exclusion, or preference based on one of the grounds enumerated in Section 10 of the Charter, and the distinction, exclusion, or preference has the effect of nullifying or impairing the right to full and equal recognition and exercise of a human right or freedom. The tribunal goes on to specify that the burden of proof is the civil burden of proof, that being the balance of probabilities, and the court ultimately finds in favor of Jeremy and explains it as follows. Paragraph 97, the tribunal finds that Ward's remarks about Jeremy's handicap and his use of a means to palliate the handicap infringed on Jeremy's right to respect for his dignity, honor, and reputation in a discriminatory manner. And I can hear some of you screaming through your computer screen that this doesn't make any sense, they're just jokes, it's a total infringement on the right to freedom of speech. And whether or not you agree with the decision, the tribunal does a very good job explaining that there are in fact competing fundamental rights at play here. You have the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression on the one hand, but you have someone's fundamental right to honor, dignity, and respect on the other. And agree or disagree with the decision, it is nonetheless well drafted and well justified. Paragraph 117. The right to equality is not absolute. A person who contravenes Section 4 and 10 of the Charter may be exonerated if he or she can demonstrate that the differential treatment denounced by the complainant is justified. Now that the tribunal has concluded that Jeremy has been a victim of discrimination, the tribunal must determine whether the infringement of his right to equality can be justified by Ward's freedom of expression. Paragraph 118, the court adds as follows. When two quasi-constitutional rights collide in a private dispute, as they do here, the rights concerned must be weighed and reconciled. The exercise is most frequently carried out by applying Section 9.1 of the Charter, which states, in exercising his fundamental freedoms and rights, a person shall maintain a proper regard for democratic values, public order, and the general well-being of the citizens of Quebec. In this respect, the scope of the freedoms and rights and limits to their exercise may be fixed by law. And I know a lot of you are not going to agree with this legislation to begin with because it can necessarily lend itself to abuse and the suppression of freedom of speech. And that is precisely what is at play here. Colliding fundamental human rights, the right to dignity, honor, and respect, versus the right to freedom of expression. And I gotta tell you that when I first started doing the research for this and reading the judgment, I had a very strong opinion on the subject, and after having read the decision fully, I'm a little conflicted because I can understand both sides of the debate. On the one hand, I may not necessarily agree with the substance of the tribunal's decision, but on the other hand, if I'm Jeremy's parents, and God forbid had Jeremy harmed himself as a result of the psychological stress caused by being mocked by this stand-up comic, I probably would have sued myself. And for those of you who are screaming at your computer screen, the Supreme Court of Canada has in fact affirmed that humor does in fact make it possible to make denigrating or hurtful comments about protected groups. And the Supreme Court of Canada has affirmed that offensive ideas do not justify infringement of the freedom of expression. So how does the tribunal in this particular decision distinguish the Supreme Court decisions from the one it is about to render? Paragraph 129. The dispute before the tribunal can be distinguished by the fact that Ward's discriminatory comments did not target a group but a specific person. The issue is therefore whether the freedom of expression protected by the Charter allows for discriminatory jokes related to the handicap of a named person. And this is kind of the crux of the decision, because we're not talking about someone making offensive jokes of people at large or anonymous or faceless people. What you have here is a stand-up comic specifically targeting a named individual, a specific identifiable and known individual making jokes specifically as relates to their handicap. Not to mention that it's a 14-year-old kid who's in high school, and high school is hard enough, let alone when you suffer from Treacher-Collins syndrome. And so you can see that it's not just a question of freedom of expression to have offensive thoughts and to share offensive thoughts and to make offensive jokes at groups groups at large. You have an individual who is targeting another individual. At what point does freedom of expression and humor become actual harassment? In his defense, Mike Ward explained that by not laughing at certain people, you are in fact treating them differently. You're sort of excluding them from the realm of humor. And in that sense, his jokes about Jeremy were in fact inclusive and non-discriminatory in that he was not excluding Jeremy from the world of humor as a result of his handicap. And Mike Ward gives an example of another individual that he has made fun of as a result of his handicap, a stand-up comic named Dave Richet. But the court ultimately comes to the conclusion that the major difference between Mike Ward making fun of Dave Richet versus Jeremy was one of consent. Dave Richet effectively consented to Mike Ward making fun of him as a result of his handicap. Jeremy never consented. And according to the court, the absence of consent to be mocked and publicly humiliated under the guise of humor was determinant in the tribunal's findings. Paragraph 136. In this case, Ward used Jeremy as a target on several occasions, identifying him by name without Jeremy's consent. Consent constitutes the major difference with the situation of Dave Richet, to whom Ward referred in his testimony. The fact that Jeremy is known to the public because of his artistic activities exposes him as a potential subject of comments and jokes in the public arena. But this should not be interpreted as a waiver of his right to respect for his honor, reputation, and dignity without discrimination based on handicap or the use of means to palliate said handicap. And this is a very important paragraph because it does note that Jeremy is something of a public figure, and as such knows that there is going to be public discussion about him, critique, humor, etc. But the court ultimately comes to the conclusion that Ward's joke, specifically targeting Jeremy as a result of his handicap and the means to palliate that handicap, exceeded the lines of what is acceptable, what is permissible, what is justifiable. Ward did it without Jeremy's consent. Jeremy is a 14-year-old kid with a serious condition, in high school, now hearing his classmates repeating Mike Ward's humor on a daily basis. And at paragraph 138, the court comes to the following conclusion. Taking the context into account, the tribunal concludes that Ward's jokes exceeded the limits of what a reasonable person must tolerate in the name of freedom of expression. The discrimination suffered by Jeremy was unjustified. Agree or disagree with the conclusion, at least now you know the facts. There are a great many details to this that many people are not aware of. It was not a one-off joke. Jeremy is a 14-year-old adolescent. He is not a consenting adult. And with all that said, now that you know the facts and details, I'm curious to know what you all think of this particular decision. If you think that the decision is total rubbish and infringes on the freedom of expression, I'm curious to know if at the very least now you can sort of empathize and understand how the tribunal came to this decision. Is there a part of you now that is potentially more sympathetic to the interplay between the freedom of expression and the right to honor and dignity, especially of a 14-year-old kid suffering from a handicap? Is there a point at which justifiable and legitimate humor becomes sanctionable harassment? And if so, when? Was this a decision where that line was crossed? And as relates to the parents and how Ward was ordered to pay damages to the parents, the court justifies their reasoning as follows. Paragraph 145. In this case, Jeremy's mother received differential treatment because of her son's handicap. Jeremy's mother was personally targeted by Ward's joke. She was not targeted as Sylvie Gabriel, but as Jeremy's mother. The jokes about her are not all discriminatory. For example, those insinuating that the dreams that came true for Jeremy were his mother's and not his own were not discriminatory. In one of the videos featuring Jeremy, however, Ward says that Jeremy's mouth does not close completely and adds, "It's an operation I would have liked, but apparently I'd rather sink my money in the sports car my mother bought. So now I'm stuck with a speaker on my head, a mouth that won't shut, and a pretty average book. Thank you very much." Ward insinuated that Jeremy did not receive the best care because his mother preferred to use his money for other purposes. This joke targets Sylvie Gabriel personally, and it is related to her son's handicap. But for Jeremy's handicap, Gabriel would not have been the target of this derogatory comment. The tribunal sees this as a discriminatory violation of her right to the safeguard of her dignity, honor, and reputation. This joke exceeds the limit of what a reasonable person must tolerate in the name of freedom of expression. This defense therefore does not stand. And finally, at paragraph 147, as for Vlawg, he was deeply affected by Ward's comment about his son and spouse. He felt angry, sad, and powerless. He himself, however, did not suffer prejudicial treatment from Ward. While the tribunal understands the feeling Vlawg expresses, it rejects the claim in this respect. The court awarded $25,000 in moral damages and another $10,000 for punitive damages. And punitive damages requires some explanation as well. Paragraph 159 reads as follows. The objective of punitive damages is to punish, denounce, and deter behavior deemed to be particularly reprehensible. An award of punitive damages seeks to sanction the perpetrator of an unlawful and intentional interference with a charter-protected right, to deter that person from repeating such interference, to dissuade third parties from acting the same way, and to express the tribunal's disapproval of such behavior. And they arbitrarily award $10,000 for punitive damages to Jeremy and $2,000 to his mother. Okay, that is the decision. I know there are a ton of people out there who are going to say this is a total unjustifiable limitation on freedom of speech. It's going to make it impossible to do stand-up comedy in Quebec and potentially even Canada. It's a situation where people are suing because of hurt feelings. I understand those arguments, but I also understand the other side, which is that there is a point at which even freedom of expression becomes sanctionable. There is a point at which freedom of expression has consequences in as much as actions have consequences. There are competing fundamental human rights in a free and democratic society. We can virtually all agree that a call to action is a legitimate restriction on freedom of speech. So we can all agree that there are certain restrictions. The question is just, what are those restrictions, and when does the freedom of expression discretion interfere with the rights of another to honor, respect, and dignity? All that said, my purpose of this video is not to answer that question, it was just to set out the decision so that you could have a better understanding of the actual details of this decision in order to form your own opinion on it. The decision itself was appealed, and we are waiting for the decision from the Court of Appeal. I happen to know the lawyer who pleaded it, so I will get news as soon as that decision is out, and I'll do a follow-up video on this, but at the very least, now you know your vlog, and whoa! If you like my video and you like my content, be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and now you know your vlog. Peace out. Boom!